Some energy efficient travel alternatives requires more travel time, which is not billable. An example would be taking rail versus flying. Is there a formula that helps balance the loss of billable time with energy efficiency? So maybe Chris, uh, might be able to touch on this.
Yeah, well, firstly, it's a very good question, and I'm not going to be able to give a straightforward answer, but I'm going to do my best. My response to that question would be that no, there isn't a simple formula that helps balance the two. Obviously, the decision is very personal to the individual and or to the firm making that choice. But what I would say is it's not always a zero-sum game rather. I mean, we have clients, for example, who actually would rather travel on the train because it's more efficient to work and they can generate more billable hours. Now, obviously, that depends upon whether you would view that as billable time or not, but we certainly do have clients that do that. So from that perspective, the equation becomes slightly different. Equally, you could argue between traveling in business class, traveling in economy, are you able to bill time if you're traveling in business class but not bill time if you're traveling in economy? So there are quite a few different moving parts to that discussion, but I'm not aware of a formula that helps balance that or make it an easy decision. But I'm going to ask Adam, because I don't know, maybe he's come across it. It's not a question I've actually been asked before, I'll be honest with you. Adam, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I've yet to be asked if there is a particular formula to balance the loss of billable time with energy efficiency. We've certainly helped many companies design the appropriate and tailored policies based on conversions like air to rail and map out the implied spend implications as well as the emissions implications. I think the broader point that in this case, it looks like Ron asked this question, which is really important, is as I alluded to before, emissions should never be taken into account in isolation from your business reality. And so I've yet to see a kind of one size fits all formula, but we've certainly helped many companies take into account with the known data that we have, the anticipated implications of modeling out some type of initiative shift, in this case from air to rail, in terms of both spend and emissions impact as well.
Yeah. Ron, I'm not sure if we answered your question or not, but it certainly is a very good one, and it's yeah, a new one on me. So thank you very much for that. What we wanted to do now is just quickly run through some of the kind of the practical steps you could take to try to reduce the impact you have from corporate travel, and as Adam's already said, some of these will be applicable and will build into your plan, and some of them are just going to be thrown straight out because they're not going to work for each individual business. So it's very personal. But look, the first thing we need to say is that the simplest way to reduce your emissions is not get on a plane. And sounds slightly counterintuitive for somebody who works for a corporate travel agent to be saying that, but it's really, really important that that's acknowledged as the primary route to achieving very, very swift emissions reduction. And I would encourage all firms, in fact, all of our clients, to look at the travel they undertake to ensure that the travel they are doing is with purpose and with a defined business outcome, because that's going to be your low-hanging fruit. The next step would be to reduce the demand. And what we see is oftentimes clients will be sending multiple individuals to the same meeting, or they'll be sending multiple people to the same locations for very, very similar purposes over a period of time. And by looking at your travel patterns, by looking at the people who are traveling, often there's a capability or an ability to identify the ability to squash and reduce the demand or the number of people that you're sending for generally similar tasks to similar locations. We've obviously then got the ability to change modes, and this is the point that Ron very called out earlier on, which is, you know, a switch from air to rail is a very, very obvious route to decarbonising. But firstly, does a rail route that's practical exist on the route that you're traveling? Question mark. Secondly, is it a time gain which is going to actually meet your needs? You know, it's not reasonable to expect somebody to spend 15 hours sat on a train when there's a 2-hour flight that's available, for example. So again, just looking at these different abilities to change the way that you travel will help to reduce overall. And then the final one is to reduce the intensity of the travel. So this could be very simply moving from business class to premium economy or to economy, because that reduces the impact of that individual traveller. That could be one option. It could be looking at the various different carriers available on a particular day and looking at who's flying the most efficient aircraft on that particular route, for example. So there are various different ways that we can reduce the emission intensity. So even if you do choose to travel by plane, you can still reduce the impact that that travel has. And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of that in just a moment. I just wanted to address another question that's come up on the chat, which is, given that we represent our client Scope 3, so I presume in the context, Paulina, you're saying, given that law firms represent part of a client's Scope 3, logically, they would want you to reduce it in the near future. So I think what you're referencing there is a dynamic that we often see. So law firms will be pressured by their clients to reduce their carbon footprints, because obviously as part of your client's Scope 3, if everybody reduces, then by virtue of that, everybody's emissions reduce. We are starting to see that. We actually have some law firms that we work with who have specific travel policies for specific clients who mandate, for example, that they aren't allowed to travel in business class when they're traveling on that particular client's business, for example. So we are starting to see that feed in, where we have very, very mandatory or specific policies that individual clients are imposing upon their law firm. But it's not something that we see as a blanket. But you're absolutely right. Logically, everybody essentially wants the same thing. It's just, as you can see from some of the conversations we're having, it's not necessarily an easily achieved objective. So Paulina, I hope I've answered your question there, but please follow up if there's anything else you want me to cover. So just looking at a couple of these practical examples, what I'm showing you here is one example of where we can look at particular routes and understand what our behaviour is and how we can change that behaviour to reduce the emission intensity of that route. So London to New York is the biggest route that Reed Mackay's legal clients fly, and we can see that over 80% of that travel is in the premium cabins, business class or first class. It seems really, really obvious to say, but if we can start to move some of the bodies from those premium cabins into premium economy or economy, then there is a natural reduction in the emissions intensity of that route that you will benefit from. And that applies across the board. Now, this can be achieved by having stricter travel approvals in place, by starting to have conversations with particular parts of the business, by starting to set more specific goals and targets for individual travellers. But it is important to say that none of this is achieved easily. And my approach would always be to go with the salami slicer type thing, just to chip away at the overall target, because trying to have one silver bullet that's going to solve the problem overnight is quite challenging. I think if we then look at some of the more nuanced or the more granular information that's available to us, we can start to see that on individual routes, and I'm hoping that the slide is magically going to move to the next one here. If we start to look at some individual routes, we can see that the dynamic between business class and economy is there. So I can see on this particular route between JFK and London Heathrow, if I travel in business class, my emissions are around about 4,000 kilograms in business class and around about 1,000 kilograms in economy. So there's an enormous saving by switching somebody from business to economy. But at the same time, if I fly on the 11 p.m. departure from JFK to London Heathrow, my emissions in business class are 4,217. Whereas if I take the 11:59 departure, my emissions drop to 3,800 or thereabouts. That dynamic is being driven by the type of plane that's being flown on that particular route at that particular time, on the load factor of that flight, on the engines used and the age of those engines, on the seating configuration, and all of those granular factors start to give a differential. So even if you can start to push people to the right option on a particular day or a particular flight or a particular time, that can also start to really, really help. So as we start to get into the nuance and the detail of these things, there are ways that we can start to affect the impact by behavioural change and driving people to make the right choice. The final thing we want to do is to make it personal. So we want to give people an individual understanding of what their impact is. So you know, I would encourage everybody to start looking at what kind of reporting can be generated to make people understand the impact of their travel, and make them understand what that means to them individually and what that means to the overall context of the firm they're working for. So if there is an emissions reduction target in place, what is the percentage that individual is impacting, and is their behaviour better or worse than that of their peers or their colleagues, or what does that look like as a benchmark against the wider industry, for example? So trying to make it individual, relevant, insightful will really help to understand how people are travelling, and hopefully to make them change their behaviour, because fundamentally that's what this is. This is, we have ingrained behaviours that we undertake when we travel, and it's trying to shift that behaviour to get the behaviour we want from our travellers.